Night stretched across the land. The wind would not rest. No one knew history was about to change forever.
People in the ancient world did not talk about giants the way we talk about dragons or fairy tales. They mentioned them the way you mention a neighboring tribe, or a dangerous ruler, or a place you don't travel after dark. Not with wonder, with caution. Across different lands, separated by oceans, languages, and centuries, there are records describing unusually large human beings, not creatures, not spirits, people. They had names, families, territories, enemies. And nobody in those records sounds surprised they existed. That's the part most modern tellings skip. The writers don't stop to convince you. They don't try to prove anything. They write about them the same way they write about kings, wars, or harvests, as if the size of these individuals was simply a fact of their world. If you lived in one of those regions, the concern wasn't mythology, it was proximity. Who controlled the land near the hills? Who guarded the river crossings? Who you might meet if a dispute turned physical? Because when conflicts happened, size stopped being a story detail and became a survival detail. And this wasn't limited to one culture trying to impress future generations. Accounts appear in the Middle East, in parts of Africa, in early Mediterranean traditions, later in European records, even in the oral histories of the Americas. Different descriptions, different names, but the same basic idea keeps resurfacing. There were people who were physically beyond the norm of their time, tall enough, strong enough, imposing enough that communities organized themselves around that fact. Some ruled, some fought, some were driven out. And over time, memory did what memory always does. It stretched things, blurred edges, added exaggeration. But exaggeration usually grows from something that already exists. Nobody invents a flood unless water reached the door. Nobody invents constant talk of unusually large warriors unless at some point someone had to stand in front of one. The question isn't just, did giants exist? A more useful question is, why did so many early societies feel the need to record encounters with people whose size changed the balance of power? Because this isn't about spectacle. It's about control, land, fear, authority. In the ancient world, physical presence could be political power. And if even a small number of individuals stood far outside normal human size ranges, they would not fade quietly into daily life. They would alter it. So in this episode, we're not chasing fantasy. We're looking at how ancient people described reality as they understood it, and why those descriptions were serious enough to be written down, preserved, and retold long after the individuals themselves were gone. Not as legends, as history, the way history looked to them. Some of the earliest written references to unusually large people come from the same region where some of the oldest city-states developed. This matters. These were not isolated villages passing down campfire tales. These were administrative cultures. They recorded trade, laws, borders, wars. They wrote to keep track of reality. And inside those records, groups described as unusually large appear not as curiosities, but as obstacles. In several early traditions from the Levant region, certain territories are described as difficult to settle, not because of climate, not because of soil, but because of the people already living there. The descriptions focus on physical scale and strength. The tone is practical. These inhabitants are not described as monsters, they are described as formidable, which tells you how they were perceived, not supernatural, not imaginary, but physically dominant. When later groups moved into those lands, the issue wasn't do they exist, The issue was, can we survive fighting them? That alone tells you the subject belonged to military reality, not folklore. Presence changes geography. There's a pattern that appears repeatedly. Regions associated with these large individuals are often linked to fortified areas, elevated ground, or places that naturally offer defensive advantage. That isn't random. If you had a group of people whose physical strength and reach gave them an edge in close combat, holding high ground or fortified towns would multiply that advantage. You don't need mythology to explain why surrounding communities would speak carefully about such groups. Geography plus size equals control, and control creates memory. The language is restrained. One of the strongest arguments that these accounts were treated seriously is the language itself. Ancient writers could be dramatic when they wanted to be. They exaggerated kings. They praised gods in overwhelming terms. But when referring to these large individuals, the wording often shifts toward description, not poetry. Tall, strong, difficult to defeat. It reads like military assessment, not legend. Almost like a scout reporting what he saw. In the modern world, height is interesting. In the ancient world, height could be decisive. Combat was close. Weapons were handheld. Reach mattered. Weight mattered. The ability to overpower an opponent without advanced tools mattered. If a minority of individuals were significantly larger than average populations of their time, their existence would not stay socially neutral. They would be recruited, feared, resisted, remembered. And this is exactly how they appear in many traditions, as warriors, rulers, champions, or threats that had to be removed before a region could stabilize. The focus is always the same. They changed the balance, not the imagination, the balance of power.
Now, this is where it gets harder to ignore. If only one culture spoke of large, ancient peoples, it would be easy to dismiss as local myth-building. But similar accounts appear across separate civilizations that did not share early communication. Different names, same pattern. A previous population, physically imposing, conflict or displacement, memory preserved in early historical or semi-historical writing. Over time, as centuries pass, the tone shifts. The practical memory becomes story-shaped. Details stretch, but the original core remains strangely consistent. There was a group before us that was bigger and harder to fight. Memory tends to simplify over generations, not invent entire physical categories from nothing. There's something historians understand well. If a group leaves a strong impression on a population, memory of them doesn't vanish, it transforms. Details blur, numbers inflate, height increases in retelling, but the presence remains anchored to a starting point. A difficult enemy becomes enormous one. A powerful fighter becomes impossibly strong. But exaggeration doesn't come from empty space. It grows from impact. And groups remembered for physical dominance would leave exactly that kind of long shadow. So when we talk about giants of the ancient world, the real subject isn't fantasy creatures. It's how early human societies recorded encounters with people whose physical scale disrupted normal expectations, and how those encounters shaped territory, warfare, and memory. The size is the headline, but the story is about power, fear, and survival in a world where physical presence could decide history. As societies around the Mediterranean began recording their histories, a familiar detail appears again. References to earlier inhabitants described as physically imposing beyond the common range. In some early Greek traditions, before the classical city-states took shape, there are mentions of older populations tied to massive construction and fortified landscapes. Later generations describe these people as larger and stronger than those who came after. What's important is not the later mythologizing. What matters is the association. Unusual size, old fortified sites, a population that existed before current settlement. That pattern mirrors what we saw in the Near East. The memory is attached to land and structures, not to fairy tales. It's tied to ruins, walls, stonework, places people could still see long after the builders were gone. When physical evidence survives but the people don't, explanation fills the gap. Large stones become linked to large builders, but that connection only sticks if earlier memory already hinted those builders were not average. Size and reputation. In Mediterranean warfare culture, reputation mattered. Stories of powerful fighters were tools of psychological warfare, but exaggeration tends to amplify a known trait. If an enemy group was known for exceptional physicality, that trait becomes their identity in memory. The description shifts from taller than us to towering over us to eventually giant. But the direction of change moves along an existing line. Moving into parts of Africa, oral histories from various regions also contain references to earlier inhabitants remembered for unusual stature and strength. These are not presented as mythical beasts, they are remembered as prior peoples, sometimes pushed out, sometimes absorbed, sometimes defeated. Again, the same structure. They were here before us, they were large, they were difficult to deal with. In societies with strong oral preservation systems, memory focuses on events that shaped survival: migrations, wars, environmental disasters, dominant enemies. Groups that physically overwhelmed others would qualify. Over time, the physical trait becomes the defining feature that carries forward, not because of fantasy, but because it explained why earlier generations struggled or moved. Even across the Atlantic, in certain indigenous traditions, there are accounts describing earlier peoples characterized by unusual size or strength. As with other regions, these groups are often framed as previous inhabitants displaced or replaced. Separated continents, different languages, no shared script traditions linking them, yet the structural memory repeats: a former people, physically imposing, conflict or transition. The similarities don't prove identical origins, but they do show that the idea of earlier physically dominant populations appears independently in multiple human memory systems. That's not typical of random fantasy themes. Fantasy tends to vary wildly. Survival memory tends to preserve similar structures. Strip away later exaggeration, and a quieter possibility sits underneath all this. Human populations in the distant past were not identical to modern averages. Nutrition, genetics, environment, and isolated gene pools could produce groups with noticeably different physical builds. If even a minority of individuals stood far outside the usual range in certain regions, they would stand out enough to enter collective memory. They would become the strong ones, the earlier people, the ones we fought, the ones who ruled before. Over centuries, that memory compresses into a single label: giants. The ancient world did not separate history and story the way we do. Memory carried facts and interpretation together.
But when the same pattern appears in multiple regions, previous inhabitants, unusual size, conflict, displacement, it points to something grounded in human experience, not pure invention, not creatures from imagination. People remembered for how their physical presence changed the balance of their time. And that is why the subject survived. Not because it was entertaining, because it mattered to survival. Most details from the ancient world disappeared. Names of ordinary people, small disputes, daily routines, gone. What survives is events and conditions that disrupted life enough to be passed down. Floods, migrations, wars, plagues, and sometimes people who changed the balance of power simply by existing. If unusually large, physically dominant individuals appeared in certain regions in the distant past, they would not be remembered for curiosity. They would be remembered because they forced decisions: where to settle, when to fight, whether to flee. That's the kind of pressure that turns experience into long-term memory. Memory keeps the impact, not the measurements. Ancient communities did not preserve height in numbers. They preserved impact in description. They didn't say, these individuals averaged this many units of measurement. They said, they were bigger than us and we could not ignore them. Over time, memory simplifies and sharpens at the same time. Details blur, impressions harden. Unusually large becomes very large, then eventually giants. The word grows, but the root stays the same. They stood outside the normal human scale people were used to. Why the idea never disappeared? Even as societies changed, the memory remained attached to land. Ruins, old walls, massive stones, abandoned settlements. When later generations looked at structures they didn't build, the past required explanation. If earlier memory already included powerful, physically imposing peoples, those memories filled the gap. Not as fantasy, but as inherited context. The land still carried the imprint even after the people were gone. What this tells us about human history. The story of giants is less about extraordinary height and more about how humans record difference. Any group that stands outside the norm in strength, size, or dominance becomes a reference point. They reshape expectations of what is possible. And once something reshapes expectations, it rarely disappears from memory. It settles into narrative. And narrative is how humans carry history across generations that never met the original witnesses.
So the question is not only whether unusually large individuals existed in ancient populations. The deeper question is, why did so many cultures consider encounters with them important enough to remember at all? Because memory is selective, and survival is what gets selected. The giants of the ancient world may not survive in bones we can point to or measurements we can verify easily, but they survive where powerful realities always survive longest, in the memory of people who had to live with the consequences. And that is where history often hides, not in what sounds dramatic, but in what people could not afford to forget.